Namaste everybody. Welcome to the fifth session of the Bhagavad Gita. We are on chapter 1 and we last completed verse 37. We're about to go to verse 38. And just to remember, it is Arjuna speaking throughout. He has now had his chariot positioned as he requested between the two armies. And if we remember from prior sessions, when he sees his relatives on both sides, he's now beginning to understand what this war is going to be about, the destruction that will result from this war, and he's naturally getting very upset. So let's move on to verses 38 and 39, which we combined.
Yes. So verse 38 and 39. Yadyapyete na pashyanti lobhopahata chetasah kulakshaya krutam dosham mitradrohe cha patakam katham nagneyam asmabhihi papadasman nivartitum kulakshaya krutam dosham prapashyadbhir janardana. So now Arjuna is giving some more reasons. He says that yadi api ete na pashyanti. He says yadi means again these they cannot see because of. Now there are three words. He says lobha upahata chetasaha. He says lobha is greed. Upahata is overpowered. Chetasaha is thoughts. He says because of the greed, their thoughts are overpowered. And then he says kulakshaya krutam dosham mitra drohe chapatakam. Kulakshaya is kindred. He says that our kula, our kindred, it's a kshaya means destroyed. That dosham, that fault, and mitra droha, the friendship, that the friends also will be killed. They don't see that. Patakam is again, as we translate as seen, but patakam means negativity. So he says that these warriors or these Kauravas, they cannot see that. And in that again he is adding katham nagneyam asmabhihi. He said by us, katham nagneyam, how can we not see that, or how can we not know that asmat papan nivartitum, by coming out or by just to get rid of these kind of great sin or the negativities. And then he says kulakshaya krutam dosham prapashyadbhir janardana. Now here he is saying Krishna is janardana. Janan ardayati. So ardanam means he's saying that not just to kill or destroy, but he says that ardanam means which is giving humans a good progress in spirituality. So he said kulakshaya krutam dosham. Kulakshaya means just again their kindred or their, by kula we say tradition or whatever their family, that can be destroyed. Why can't they see that? So this is what the purpose of these two slokas.
So basically Arjuna says their thoughts are overpowered by greed and they see no wrong in annihilating their relatives or quarreling with friends. Yet, O Janardhan, meaning Sri Krishna, why should we, who can clearly see the crime in killing our kindred, not turn away from this sin? So we can see that Arjuna is slowly coming to the stage of saying, I don't want to fight, but he's not there yet. Right now he's questioning, why are we doing these acts? So he points out that the actions and attitudes of the Kaurava stem from what? Their common sense being overpowered by greed. And greed for what? Greed for the kingdom, greed for wealth. And that greed is basically overcoming all moral scruples. It may seem intuitively obvious to us that greedy people are going to have a lower sense of ethics, morality, values than people who are not so affected by greed. But it's always good to have what we would instinctively think validated. So let's have a look at the study published 27th February 2012 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, where 7 different experiments were conducted with participants from different socio-economic backgrounds. Different socio-economic backgrounds means that some were from people who maybe had less money, less wealth, less status, and others who were higher on what's called the socio-economic scale obviously came from more money, they were more respected in society, maybe had more power within society. So in their first two experiments, they monitored traffic at a four-way stop. So like this, four ways, going this way, going this way. And it was done at an intersection in San Francisco. And they started noting the makes and models of the cars, the vehicles that passed, because the makes and models of cars are sometimes a very good indicator of the socio-economic background of that particular individuals. And what they were trying to do was to see which drivers were rude, cut off other vehicles, cut off pedestrians, basically didn't bother with consideration for other people. Now it was very interesting because their findings were that rude behavior, inconsiderate behavior, rose with status. So the high socio-economic scale drivers were roughly twice as inconsiderate as low socio-economic scale drivers, which is pretty well on a par with what we would expect. The study concludes, and I'm quoting from the study now, people often act unethically, not because they're desperate or they're in the dumps, but because they feel entitled and they want to get ahead. Now, Duryodhan, being a king, was a completely different character to Arjun. Duryodhan was driven by his greed, and we've seen from episodes we've quoted in his life. Remember, he tried to burn the Pandavas in a palace built with combustible materials. He played a game of dice which was deliberately loaded, so he was dishonest. So we can see that he, a king, had very little regard for ethics or morality. He was interested in what can I get for myself. I don't care how I get it, but what can I get? But it's a testament to Arjun's character that the power, wealth, status that went with being a prince, as was Duryodhana a prince, it was his father who was the king, but in Arjun's case, it did not in any way affect his ethics. And that's what was seen by what he's saying to Sri Krishna. And that is one of the reasons he would have been so dear to Sri Krishna. Basically, if we read this paragraph of Arjun's, he's saying two wrongs don't make a right. Just because Duryodhan is utterly immoral, driven by his greed, unscrupulous, and unscrupulous enough literally to kill for what he can get, does not mean that we should reduce ourselves to the same level and commit an equally heinous act. So he's basically saying we should, for our part, desist from this act.
So now Arjuna is adding again in this verse 40, Kulakshaye pranashyanti kuladharma sanatanaha dharme nashte kulam krutsnam adharmo bhibhavatyuta. So now in previous verse he says Kulakshaya. Kulakshaya means again he says as our dynasty will be destroyed. So now he says that Kulakshaye pranashyanti kuladharmaha sanatanaha. He says once dynasty or whatever tradition, once that will be destroyed, then what can happen? He says kuladharmaha sanatanaha. Then whatever the duties, whatever the sanatana dharma which we are following from years, he said that will be also destroyed. And he said dharme nashte kulam krutsnam. He said dharme nashte, and one dharma. So dharma here again it is responsibility, duties, or we can say our sanatana dharma. So he says dharme nashte. When that dharma is destroyed, then kulam krusnam, the complete our dynasty will be destroyed, and then what will happen? He says adharmaha abhavati uta. He says then adharma means in religion will overcome. So he says once that our Sanatana Dharma, whatever that we have followed, once that will be destroyed, then irreligion will overcome. So this is what he is saying in this verse.
So Arjuna is continuing to speak. He says, when a dynasty is destroyed, its traditions get vanquished, and the rest of the family becomes involved in irreligion. What exactly does he mean by this? Dynasty here doesn't necessarily mean the dynasty of a king. It refers to any family and its generations. So every family is a dynasty. Let's think and bring ourselves forward to our times today, or close to our times today. When the Nazis annihilated Jews by the millions, thousands of children were orphans. Being orphans, desperate to survive, from whom were they going to learn their family traditions, Jewish traditions? What were the reasons for those traditions? There was nobody to teach them, because their parents, uncles, aunts, grandparents were in concentration camps, even if they themselves somehow managed to escape. Those that did survive during the war and after the war had to manage to fend for themselves. So how would they grow up understanding right from wrong? Yes, to some extent we all have an instinct for what is right and wrong, but when we're in such desperate straits, maybe our instinct also gets overpowered. We do what we need to do to survive. There was nobody to guide them, not grandparents, not older people who might have been friends, aunts, uncles. They were all enslaved and dying in Nazi concentration camps, which are visible. You can visit them today. They were trying to survive, earn somehow a living for their basic food and necessities, clothing. Now, in this situation, can we seriously expect them to be worrying about rights and wrongs of the means of survival? They will do what's required to survive. So Arjuna, quite rightly, is fearing for the families left behind once the soldiers on both sides have died. He's saying, how will their families manage? We will see in the next verse, he turns to the plight specifically of the women.
So now again Arjuna is also adding that what happens. He says, Adharma bhibhavat Krishna pradushyanti kulastriyah stri sudushta suvarshneya jayate varnasankarah. He says, Adharma abhavati. It says that once a religion or the duties are not followed, it says by that pradushyanti kulastriyah. Kulastriyah means all women from a family. Pradushyanti, they will follow immorality. It says strisu dushtasu varshneya. Once that women who will follow immorality, then they will progen, or they will give birth of kids which are they call varna sankara. Varna sankara means unwanted progeny. So he said that once those women will go to other places, they will follow immorality, and then they will have unwanted progeny or unwanted kids.
So this is now verse 41. Still Arjuna speaking. He's giving more and more reasons why this war shouldn't be fought. And he now says, with the preponderance of vice, O Krishna, the women of the family become immoral. And from the immorality of women, O descendant of Vrishni, unwanted progeny are born. Now when the family unit breaks down, societal bonds and norms also break down. But what is society after all except lots of different families put together? So when the individual unit breaks down, then if enough individual units break down, society as a whole will also break down. Now in Vedic times, women held a very special position in society. They were highly respected. They were the very foundation of a family and of society. They were also highly educated. But roles in those days were much more clearly defined than today. Whether we believe that's right or wrong is another issue, but that is how it was. And generally, the man went to work and he provided for the family. The woman took care of the children, so it was from the woman that they learned their values and ethics. After a war, Arjuna is worried, with the menfolk gone, so the provider gone, what he's now worried about is that the women, to keep the household running, to provide for the children, might turn to prostitution to earn a living. And what would happen now? It could give rise to unwanted children. Now, if we put ourselves, if we can think back to being a child, what is worse for a child than feeling unwanted? And that is what Arjuna is worried about, and quite rightly. We'll see in the next verse, verse 42.
Now he says, Sankaro narakayaiva kulagnanam kulasya cha patanti pitaro hyesham luptapindo dakakriyaha. So now he says, Sankaro narakayaiva. The word, it is not Shankara, it is Sankara. So Sankara means again unwanted child or children. He says, Sankaraha narakayaiva. Naraka means, again, in that concept it is hell, but Naraka is which is negative place. So he said those unwanted children will lead the whole family or everyone towards the negative or negativity or hell. It says kulagnanam kulasyacha, and they will destroy their family and whatever the family tradition. Then he says that by that, patanti pitaraha hesham, by that all their ancestors, pitaraha means ancestors, their ancestors will also fall from their great place wherever they are. And there is one ritual in Hinduism, as we know, Pinda Dana Kriya. So he said then all the rituals which is done for ancestors or for family, that will be also destroyed, or that will be disappear if there will be unwanted children.
So Arjuna says, an increase in unwanted children results in hellish life, both for the family and for those who destroy the family. Deprived of sacrificial offerings, the ancestors of such corrupt families also fall. This is an interesting verse, so let's look at it in a little bit more detail and how right Arjuna is. The more unwanted children there are in a society, the more problems that society will face. There was a very long-term study done whose findings were summarized in the Washington Post on 15 August 1989. And it dealt with the effects on society and the children of being unwanted. And it makes truly grim reading, and I'm going to give you the highlights. The study received financial support from the Czechoslovakian government. Now it's not Czechoslovakian, this Czech Republic and Slovak Republic. At that point it was one country. It received funding from the US National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, the World Health Organization, and the World Federation for Mental Health, and also the Ford Foundation. So it was quite a large study, as we can see. Now let me give you the highlights of the results. Mothers of unwanted children were less likely to nurse their babies, and when they did breastfeed, they did it for a shorter period of time. In other words, not necessarily until the child was satisfied. By preschool, the unwanted children were more frequently described by their mothers as being naughty, stubborn, and bad-tempered. So already preschool, it was having an effect on the children, even if they were living in a home, living with their mother. This is now compared to children who were wanted. By the third grade, the unwanted children disliked school more than the wanted children. They were also rated by their teachers as being less diligent. They showed less concentration on their studies, less initiative, and less tidiness. So this is by 3rd grade. By they were aged 9, there were now considerable problems, the study says. The unwanted children were generally rejected as friends by their schoolmates. So the problems of being unwanted now started to manifest in their character, and that character meant that other school children who were wanted children no longer wanted to be friends with them. And there's nothing worse for a child than social isolation. By the ages of 14 to 17, school performance differences became statistically significant. The unwanted children practically never appeared on the roster of outstanding students in any subject. So now we can see a definite decline in their scholastic abilities too. By the early 20s, the unwanted group was experiencing a growing number of psychological difficulties. What were these? Their names were more likely to appear on rosters of drug addicts, alcoholics, psychiatric patients, and criminals. If this is not a hellish situation for both family and especially the children, it's difficult to think of a better description than Arjuna himself gives it. Then we have to explore the concept of reincarnation. Remember, Arjuna says that the deprived of sacrificial offerings, he says, the ancestors of such corrupt families also fall. So let's explore the concept of reincarnation. What is he referring to? He says, we can see now from the study I've shown you that we have a family that's in serious trouble. It's very likely that those who love us, our grandparents, great-grandparents, our ancestors, who may be no more on this planet, but now they will choose to take birth with us to help us out. So instead of progressing themselves, they're now affected by our problems and come back to help us. So in this context, they have fallen instead of progressing. One of the largest studies of reincarnation was carried out by Professor Ian Stevenson from the University of Virginia School of Medicine as chair of the Department of Psychiatry. It was carried out from 1957 to 1967. He was the Carlson Professor of Psychiatry from 1967 to 2001. He was also the Research Professor of Psychiatry from 2002 until his death in 2007. So a very, very eminent scholar. His studies are well publicized, they're accessible to anyone, and to give you the name again, is Professor Ian, I-A-N, Stevenson. So you can look up his studies anywhere. His work is now being further advanced by Dr. Jim Tucker, Assistant Professor of Medicine at the university, same university, University of Virginia, and also by researchers at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. Now the cases are far too numerous to mention here. Professor Stevenson himself studied well over 3,000 cases with scientific rigor, and since then, since his passing, thousands more have been studied. So we have a substantial body of evidence for reincarnation, and it is that to which Arjuna is referring. Arjuna then refers to sacrificial offerings. What does he mean by that? A sacrificial offering to God or anyone else, to Bhagwan or anyone else, it doesn't consist of a bit of ghee and rice or whatever one offers. It's when we choose to tend a sick loved one. That is a sacrificial offering because we are giving up our time to do that when we could be doing something more enjoyable. Maybe people like to go to a movie. Maybe people want to go rollerblading. Whatever it is, instead of doing what we would really wish to do, we are sacrificing our time to look after our loved one. In this context, reading the Gita or listening to the Gita is also a sacrifice to the Paramatma. Why? Because we are choosing to do something disciplined to understand his teachings rather than go to the beach, a party, or watch a movie. Basically, Arjuna is saying that in behaving in ways that produce unwanted children, we dishonor our ancestors. And because they love us, that may impel them to leave their plane wherever they are and fall to this plane to help us. That's the context in which he's speaking. Let's look at verse 43 and what Arjuna says.
Now he says, Doshai etai kulagnanam varna sankarakarakai utsadyante jati dharmaha kuladharmascha shashvataha. He says now, kulagnanam varna sankarakarakai. He says by varna sankara, by unwanted children, kulagnanam, again, as we say, the dynasty or family, which is destroyed by these faults, utsadyanti jati dharmaha. He says jati dharmaha. Here jati doesn't mean the casteism. Jati again, which we see in the further verse, in the further chapters. But jati means here that whatever the duties are given to every families. He says that those and kula dharma, which is the family tradition, which are shashvataha, which has come continuously from many years. So he said those will be again destroyed by these unwanted children.
So Arjuna says, through the evil deeds of those who destroy the family tradition and thus give rise to unwanted progeny, a variety of social and family welfare activities are ruined. He's carrying on from the previous verse. And we've covered the issue of the problems caused by this unwanted progeny in detail in the last verse, so I won't repeat here. We saw the study in the Washington Post that these unwanted children eventually turn to drugs and criminal activities. It seems obvious, we don't have to belabor the point, that they are going to very adversely affect society and the welfare of their particular family. So let's go to verse 44.
Yeah. Now he says, Utsanna kula dharmanam manushyanam janardana narake niyatam vaso bhavati tyanushruma. He says, Utsanna kula dharmanam. By destroying or by destroyed, once that family tradition is destroyed, then narake aniyatam vasa. He says naraka, again it's hell or any the negative place. Aniyatam vasa. Aniyatam means which is not for a certain time, which is indefinite. He said they will stay there continuously for whatever time. He says, now Arjuna says, iti anusushruma. Anusushruma means this is what I have heard. So here Arjuna says that I have heard that by unwanted children, when the family is destroyed, and then their ancestors will stay in hell for long or indefinite time.
So Arjuna says, O Janardhan, Sri Krishna, I have heard from the learned that those who destroy family traditions dwell in hell for an indefinite period of time, or instead of indefinite, we could say an undefinable period of time. We don't know how long. In the verses that we've already explored, we saw what has happened to families that are destroyed. We've seen what happens to the children. Unwanted children end up in drug taking, drug peddling. The use of drugs, alcohol and other stuff increases. Basically, criminality increases. Now, if we accept the theory of reincarnation, and we will come into the research of that more in later chapters, it's obvious that the type of life that we get in our next life will depend very heavily on the type of life we've led in this one. And Sri Krishna will actually come to this specific issue much later in chapters 7 and 8, where we will see that the type of life that we manifest, even in this life, is likely to depend on our thoughts, our actions, our deeds. But let's explore that when we come to it. Right now, this is what Arjuna is saying. But we can see this is also the simple theory of cause and effect. What you do has an effect. In other words, if you have a table and your foot is under it and you kick it with your other foot, well, the table is going to fall down and you will crack your foot. Simple cause and effect. And that's what he's referring to. So the ones who have committed grave acts of wrong during their lives and have caused untold misery, not only to themselves, but to other people as well, then they are likely to end up with lives that are very negative. I mean, he uses the word hellish, but hellish in this context doesn't mean a place where we all go and burn. It simply means that our life becomes very unpleasant with a myriad of problems for ourselves and for other people until the wrongdoing is expiated. It's very interesting also that past lives, remember we said past lives will impact our future life, but past lives may also impact our physical bodies in this life. See some bodily malformations attributed to previous lives. The research was done in the report by Satwant Pasricha, Department of Clinical Psychology, National Institute of Mental Health and Neurosciences in Bangalore. Also by the Department of Psychology, University of Tasmania, Hobart, Tasmania, Australia, and Department of Psychiatric Medicine at the University of Virginia. And I'll just tell you one very interesting story from this particular publication by Jim Tucker and Ian Stevenson. There was a man, I believe it was in Thailand, who was riding a bicycle and for whatever reason was killed by a shot to his head, which entered from one side, came out the other side. He survived for a short while and he told his distraught wife, "I will come back to you." He passed away. His wife didn't think anything much of it, except that in Thailand also many people do believe in reincarnation. And she kept remembering his promise, "I will come back to you." She got remarried. Eventually she gave birth to a baby. The baby was born with a clear scar here and here, where the bullet had entered and where the bullet had come out. So even our physical appearance can be affected by our next life. So the study seemed to imply this particular one. Let's go to verse 45 and 46, which again we've taken together.
Aho batamahat papam kartum vyavasita vayam yadrajya sukha lobhena hantum svajanamudyataha yadi mamapatikaram ashastra sastrapanayah dhartarashtarane hanyus tanme kshemataram bhavet. Now Arjuna says, Aho bata mahat papam. Bata means here, Aho means this is just the way he talks. He says, Bata is horrible result. Mahat papam kartum vyavasita. He said, Mahat papam means great sin. Kartum means to do. Vyavasita vayam. We are all gathered here to do great papam means sins or negativity. He says, why? Yad rajya sukha lobhena. Because of Rajya is kingdom, Sukha means again to enjoy, Lobha is greedy. So he says for the greed of having kingdom, he says we are eager or we are ready to kill Swahantum Swajanam. He said we are ready and we are eager to kill our own relatives. He says Yadi Mama Pratikaram Ashastram Sastra Prani. Yadi, if Mom, he says, even though it's me, apratikaram, I'm not going to even respond back. And ashastram, if I have no weapon, sastrapanayaha. So here is sastrapanayaha means he's talking about Kauravas. He says those Kauravas with who are having their weapons, to me who has no weapon, if they will kill me in this, rane hanyu, asmin rane means he says that even in this war, if they will kill me, I'm not going to have my weapon, and if they will kill me, then he says, Tanme kshema taram bhavet. That will be even better than even fighting. So he says that I don't want, so indirectly he's saying that I'm not ready to fight, because we all are gathered just of the greed of having kingdom.
So Arjuna now continues his reasoning to avoid this war. He says, alas, how strange it is that we have set our mind to perform this great sin with horrifying consequences. Driven by the desire for kingly pleasures, we are intent on killing our own kinsmen. It would be better if with weapons in hand, the sons of Dhritarashtra kill me unarmed and unresisting on the battlefield. Now, based on all the consequences that Arjuna has already pointed out, you remember he said the women can turn to prostitution, the children have no one to guide them, the children feel unwanted. He's in a situation where he says that for me, I simply cannot understand how we can possibly proceed with this war. Essentially, his question is this, that if we fully understand the consequences of this war, and in the modern context, we can say if we understand the consequences of any war, we know the consequences, not only on the men who may get killed or the women who might be on the battlefield today as well, but what about the consequences on the women left behind, the children left behind, society as a whole? How can we then proceed with this course of action? I wish leaders today ask themselves this very question. Are we really going to do all this just for a kingdom and some wealth? A bit of land, a bit of wealth, we're going to kill thousands of people? Finally, Arjuna expresses the view that as far as he's concerned, it would be far better for him that the evil sons of Dhritarashtra, who have no such compunctions, it's okay, he says, if they come and kill me, rather than that I engage in this war. It's of course quite clear by this time now that Arjuna has worked himself up into almost a frenzy, not quite yet, that'll come later, and honestly has completely lost his balance. Now, why do we say he's completely lost his balance? Let's see why his views are a loss of balance when we look at history. What if the Allied forces had said that about Nazi Germany? Well, if we leave the Nazis to it, 9 million Jews will die. 6 million actually did die. Because of Allied and Russian intervention, 3 million survived. But never mind, the rest of us will live. Okay, 6 million Jews will die, then that's fine. We're all going to be here. Because overall in World War II, an estimated total of 75 to 80 million people perished, or about 3% of the 1940 world population, which was about 2.3 billion. So it was a massive toll on the human race. Instead, they could have desisted from the war and just said, fine, let all the Jews go, we're fine. That could have been the Allied calculation, using Arjuna's logic. That 9 million Jews go, but on the other side, we're going to save 60 to 70 million people from dying. So let's leave Hitler to it. But this doesn't take into account, does it, that evil increases when it faces no opposition. And it would have been not merely Jews who died. Having succeeded and faced no opposition, what would have happened? The Nazi bullying machine would naturally have become very emboldened. Well, they were anyway, despite the fact that the Allies counterattacked. Remember what happened in World War II. They went from one country to another. They went from Poland, Austria, and then eventually France, even into Russia. So despite the Allied opposition, the Nazi war machine continued. Imagine what would have happened if there had been no Allied opposition whatsoever. They would have moved much faster, killed a lot more people. And they would have started, they did indeed start, on the Slavs, the Russians, colored people, and continued without end until only the so-called Aryan race, as defined by the Germans, the Aryan race, would have survived. So not only actually would the death toll have been much higher, it would have been the end of society as we know it. We would all have been living in a Nazi-controlled world. But Arjuna, apart from his logic, was also overwhelmed with compassion, and he had the natural reluctance to kill his own species. You remember we saw that in a previous verse when we commented verses 36 and 37, the study that showed that when soldiers were asked to fire, we think as many as 80% from Slam Marshall, if you remember that study, did not fire. Because it's a natural reluctance of most men to kill their fellow human beings. In verses 34 and 35, we also said we'd look into why these verses are a glimpse into Arjuna's extraordinary character and why he was so dear to Sri Krishna. And you see now the reason why. There was also a study carried out about how wealth affects a man's compassion and empathy towards others. And the findings clearly showed that the more wealthy had significantly less compassion towards their fellow beings than those with much less wealth. In other words, wealth creates problems or can create problems for ourselves, in that we end up with a lack of empathy, sympathy, compassion for our fellow beings because we develop an inability to put ourselves in their shoes. The study concluded as riches grow, empathy for others seems to decline. The findings were published in Scientific American on 10th April 2010. Now the surprising thing is that the findings are there. We may all understand the findings, and yet the reality is that as people grow wealthy, they grow less empathetic. But we can see that Arjuna's compassion and empathy, despite being a king with both wealth, tremendous power all his life, has not declined in the slightest. They are in full swing. Hence, he was very dear to Sri Krishna. If we ourselves lack empathy and compassion, both essential characteristics for any good person, but if we lack those characteristics of compassion and empathy for our fellow creation, we cannot use our wealth for the benefit of others. We cannot empathize with those in trouble. How could we expect to be dear to God? Verse 47.
Sanjaya Uvacha Evamuktvārjuna Sankhye Rathopastha Upavishat Visrujya Sasharam Chapam Shokasam Vignamanasah. Now this is the final verse of chapter 1. Now Sanjay says, Evam Uktva. After saying this, Arjun, Sankhye, in this battlefield, Rathopastha Upavishat, on the chariot, he just sat down. He said, how? He said, Visrujya Sasharam Chapam. Visrujya means he just removed the bow and arrow. Sasaram Chapam, he removed both. Shoka Samvigna Manasa. So how is Arjun now? As a warrior, now he has changed himself. He says Shoka, which is grief, Samvigna, which is distressed, and Manasaha is mind. So whose mind is distressed by grief. So now Arjun is completely full of grief. He just sat down on the chariot.
Sanjay says, remember he's now speaking to Dhritarashtra, the blind king. Sanjay said, speaking thus, Arjun cast aside his bow and arrows and sank into the seat on his chariot, his mind in distress and overwhelmed with grief. Arjun's desire to not enter the battlefield out of mistaken compassion, it's now reached its climax. We can see that not in a single sentence does Arjun consider what will happen and the consequences to society if evil is allowed to triumph. You remember we just looked at what would have happened to the world as a whole if Hitler had been allowed to triumph. But Arjun is so overwhelmed with grief, with compassion, that he never asks himself the logical question that yes, the consequences of fighting this war are that people will die. But what are the consequences of not fighting this war? And he never asked himself that logical question. So he now simply casts aside his weapons and he sinks into the seat of his chariot, completely overwhelmed with confusion and utterly distressed. That brings us to the end of the first chapter. We hope you'll continue with us into chapter 2, and we will see Arjun, who continues to be distressed for the first 10 verses, and then for the first time in chapter 2, verse 11, Sri Krishna starts to teach. And the Bhagavad Gita gets far more interesting at that point. And we hope you'll join us. Thank you very much for your time again, and thank you for listening.
Namaste.
Namaste. Jai Shri Krishna.